Imagine being promised free healthcare for a disease you did not even know you had, only to later discover that those who vowed to treat you were intentionally withholding life-saving medicine. This is not a story from a thriller or a dark fiction novel. It is a shocking truth that unfolded over 4 decades ago in the United States, marking one of the most unethical chapters in medical history. Between 1932 and 1972, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment was carried out by the U.S. Public Health Service, targeting approximately 600 black men in rural Alabama. These men, many of whom were poor sharecroppers with limited education, were told they would receive free medical care for a condition called bad blood, a vague term that masked the reality. Most of them were already infected with syphilis, a serious and potentially fatal disease. But instead of treating their illness, the government conducted a study to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis. Even more disturbing, when penicillin was discovered in the 1940s and became the standard effective cure, it was deliberately withheld from these men. For 40 years, these individuals were denied proper treatment, suffering severe health consequences while being monitored without their informed consent. This experiment is not just a story of medical failure. It reveals a deep-rooted systemic injustice and exploitation based on race. It exposed how scientific research, when stripped of ethics and compassion, can become a tool of harm rather than healing. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment left an indelible scar on the African American community's trust in the healthcare system, a mistrust that still echoes today. In this video, we will take a deep dive into the origins of the Tuskegee study, uncover the shocking details of how it was conducted, and explore the lasting impact it has had on society. We will also discuss the lessons learned and why remembering this history is crucial for ensuring that medical ethics and equality are upheld for everyone. If you want to understand this dark chapter of history and its ongoing effects, stay tuned till the end. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming stories that uncover hidden truths and shed light on important issues. Let us begin this journey together to remember those who suffered and to ensure such injustice never happens again. The story of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment is not just about numbers or dates, it is about real people, real lives caught in a web of deception and betrayal. The men who participated were mostly poor, uneducated sharecroppers from rural Alabama, individuals who had already been marginalized by society long before this tragic chapter began. Their daily lives were defined by hard labor, limited resources, and a lack of access to proper health care. When the Public Health Service approached them with the promise of free medical care for what they called bad blood, it sounded like a blessing, an opportunity to receive attention and treatment that was otherwise unavailable. This phrase, bad blood, was a catch-all term used at the time to describe a range of ailments, from anemia to fatigue, but most importantly, it masked the true and dangerous nature of their illness. Syphilis. What these men did not know was that the very people they trusted to help them were not acting in their best interests. Instead of offering genuine treatment, the men were misled into becoming subjects of a study that would observe the devastating effects of untreated syphilis over time. They were given placebos, aspirin, mineral supplements, and other ineffective remedies while the disease slowly ravaged their bodies. The doctors involved in the experiment withheld not only treatment but the truth itself, ensuring that these men never fully understood the severity of their condition or the risks they faced. The deception extended far beyond the participants themselves. Many of the men's families, friends, and communities were kept in the dark. The experiment's architects exploited the men's trust and exploited the racial and social inequalities deeply embedded in American society at the time. These men were seen not as patients deserving care, but as data points to be observed. A chilling reminder of how systemic racism can warp the principles of medical ethics and human dignity. As the years went by, the suffering of these men grew more severe. without access to penicillin, which became widely accepted as the standard treatment for syphilis by the 1940s. Their health deteriorated drastically. Some developed severe complications such as heart disease, mental illness, and blindness. Others died prematurely from conditions that could have been prevented with proper care. And all the while, the study continued in silence, hidden away from public scrutiny, sustained by the indifference and complicity of institutions that should have protected the vulnerable. What makes this story even more heartbreaking is the betrayal of trust not just between doctor and patient, but between a government and its citizens. These men came seeking help, hoping for relief from their suffering, and instead found themselves trapped in a nightmare. The experiment stripped them of their autonomy and dignity, treating them as mere subjects rather than human beings with hopes, fears, and families who depended on them. It was not until decades later that the truth began to emerge, thanks to investigative journalism and courageous whistleblowers who refused to remain silent. When the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment was finally exposed in 1972, it ignited outrage across the nation, forcing a reckoning with the gross injustices that had been perpetrated under the guise of science. The public was horrified to learn that a government-sanctioned study had allowed hundreds of men to suffer and die unnecessarily, simply to observe how a disease progressed untreated. The legacy of this experiment goes far beyond the immediate harm done to its victims. It sowed deep seeds of mistrust between the African American community and the healthcare system, a mistrust that has persisted for generations and has influenced attitudes toward medical research and treatment to this day. The echoes of Tuskegee have been felt in modern public health challenges, including skepticism toward vaccines and reluctance to participate in clinical trials. Understanding the full human cost of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment means recognizing not just the physical toll but the emotional and psychological scars left on the men, their families, and their communities. It is a painful reminder of how easily vulnerable populations can be exploited when power and prejudice intersect. Yet, it also serves as a crucial lesson, one that underscores the importance of transparency, informed consent, and respect for all patients regardless of race or background. As we reflect on this tragic history, we honor the courage of those who endured unimaginable suffering and the voices of those who fought to bring this dark truth to light. Their story is a call to vigilance and accountability, a demand that such violations of ethics and humanity never happen again. In sharing this narrative, we commit to remembering the past so that the future of medicine can be built on trust, equity, and compassion for all. From the very beginning, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment was designed with a chilling purpose: to watch the natural progression of syphilis in black men who were left untreated. The experimenters wanted to document how the disease would develop, step by step, without intervention, despite knowing that a safe and effective cure was within reach. Penicillin, discovered in the early 1940s, had revolutionized medicine by providing a powerful treatment for syphilis, turning what had been a devastating, often fatal disease into one that could be cured with a simple course of antibiotics. Yet, this cure was deliberately withheld from the men involved in the study, not because it was unavailable, but because the researchers prioritized their observation over the health and lives of their subjects. This decision to withhold treatment even after penicillin's arrival underscores a horrifying aspect of the experiment. It was not just negligence or ignorance, but a calculated choice that sacrificed human lives on the altar of scientific curiosity and systemic racism. The men, already misled to believe they were receiving care for bad blood, were instead condemned to suffer the slow and painful damage caused by untreated syphilis, including heart complications, neurological damage, blindness, and in many cases, premature death. What makes this situation even more tragic is the deliberate obstruction that extended beyond the research team. Local doctors, government officials, and public health workers were complicit in discouraging treatment for these men, actively preventing penicillin from reaching them. This was not a case of passive omission, but an active suppression of a known cure. Families watched helplessly as their loved ones deteriorated, unaware that medicine could have saved them. The rationale given by some officials to justify the continuation of the study was couched in the language of science and progress, claiming the research was necessary to understand the full impact of untreated syphilis. Yet, such justification ignores the fundamental principle that research must never harm its participants. Especially when a cure exists, the experimenters treated these men as mere data points, disregarding their humanity, pain, and right to health. Throughout the 1940s and beyond, as penicillin became widely accepted and distributed across the country, the men in Tuskegee remained in the shadows, excluded from this medical breakthrough. While countless others were cured, they were deliberately left to endure the devastating stages of their illness. The slow march of syphilis within their bodies was observed and recorded meticulously, but no effort was made to intervene. This ongoing denial of treatment and truth was a stark example of the deep-seated racial inequalities embedded in the American healthcare system at the time. It reflected a broader pattern where African Americans were systematically denied access to quality healthcare and medical advancements. The Tuskegee study exemplified how scientific research could be warped by prejudice and power imbalances, turning those who should be cared for into subjects of exploitation. The men's suffering continued for decades, with many experiencing the full, harrowing progression of syphilis, which can affect the brain, heart, and other vital organs. Some developed neurosyphilis, leading to mental deterioration. Others faced stroke, paralysis, or death from cardiac complications. Their physical decline was a living testament to the cruelty embedded in the experiment's design. This calculated choice to observe untreated syphilis, rather than to heal it, was only brought to an end when the story was exposed to the public in 1972 by investigative journalists. The revelation of such a grave ethical violation sent shockwaves through the nation, igniting outrage and condemnation. It became clear that what had been framed as scientific research was, in truth, a gross abuse of human rights and dignity. The legacy of this decision to withhold penicillin is felt even today. It left a deep wound not only on the men and their families but on an entire community, fostering distrust toward medical institutions and research. Understanding this part of the Tuskegee story reminds us why ethical standards, informed consent, and equality in healthcare are not just ideals but essential protections against repeating such injustices. By looking back at this painful history, we honor the lives affected and recommit ourselves to a future where science serves humanity with respect, compassion, and justice, never sacrificing people in the name of progress. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment stands as one of the darkest and most painful reminders of how systemic racism can infect even the fields meant to heal and protect. This study was not merely a misguided scientific inquiry, but a deliberate act of medical exploitation, deeply rooted in the racial inequalities that plagued America, especially in the South. The men involved were not treated as patients deserving care and compassion, but as subjects to be used and discarded, reflecting a broader pattern of dehumanization toward African American communities. In the early 20th century, segregation and discriminatory laws shaped nearly every aspect of life for Black Americans, dictating where they could live, work, and receive medical care. Healthcare facilities were segregated, and those available to African Americans were often underfunded, inadequate. This lack of access created fertile ground for unethical practices like the Tuskegee study, where the vulnerability of an already marginalized group was cynically exploited under the guise of scientific research. The experiment was fueled by pervasive racial prejudices that viewed Black people not as equal citizens but as lesser beings, unworthy of the same rights and protections. These harmful attitudes justified, in the minds of the experimenters, The decision to withhold treatment and information. The men who participated were seen as mere data points. Their suffering considered collateral damage in the pursuit of medical knowledge. This mindset stripped away their dignity and ignored the fundamental principle that all humans deserve respect and care, regardless of race or social standing. What makes this exploitation so egregious is that it was not hidden in the shadows but conducted openly by a government agency entrusted with protecting public health. The US Public Health Service, responsible for safeguarding the well-being of all citizens, instead chose to perpetuate inequality and injustice. Collaborating with local institutions and leveraging the trust these communities placed in them, the agency manipulated and deceived these men, maintaining a cruel charade that promised treatment while actively denying it. The study also violated every standard of medical ethics, including informed consent, honesty, and beneficence. The men were never fully informed of their diagnosis, nor were they told that effective treatment existed and was being withheld. Instead, they were subjected to invasive procedures and regular examinations, all while their health deteriorated. Their consent, if it could even be called that, was obtained through deception and caution. This blatant disregard for autonomy and well-being reflects a profound breach of trust that is nearly unimaginable by today's standards but was disturbingly commonplace in an era rife with racial discrimination. Beyond the immediate victims, the Tuskegee experiment cast a long shadow over the African American community's relationship with the healthcare system. The betrayal and suffering inflicted fostered a deep-seated mistrust, one that echoes in contemporary healthcare disparities and hesitations toward medical treatment. It serves as a painful reminder of how systemic racism can undermine public health and perpetuate cycles of inequality and neglect. This dark chapter also highlights the dangers of allowing prejudice and power imbalances to dictate scientific research. When those in authority dehumanize and exploit vulnerable populations, the consequences extend far beyond the lab or clinic. They erode the social fabric, damage communities, and stain the integrity of medicine itself. As we reflect on this history, it is crucial to recognize the strength and resilience of the men and families affected, who endure unimaginable pain and injustice. Their experience demands that we remain vigilant against any form of discrimination in healthcare and research, and that we commit to upholding the highest ethical standards to ensure respect, fairness, and equality for all. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, while a testament to the failures of the past, also offers a powerful lesson. Science and medicine must always serve humanity with compassion and justice. By acknowledging these wrongs, we can work toward a future where no one is ever exploited or denied care because of the color of their skin or their social status, and where trust between communities and healthcare providers can be rebuilt and sustained. In the segregated South of early 20th century America, Black communities lived under a harsh reality defined not only by systemic racism but also by the cruel limitations imposed on their access to basic health care. This denial was not accidental but a direct consequence of Jim Crow laws and deeply entrenched social prejudices that shaped every aspect of life for African Americans, especially in rural areas like Alabama. Hospitals, clinics, and medical practitioners who served white populations often barred Black patients or relegated them to inferior facilities lacking adequate resources. For many Black Americans, seeking medical help meant traveling great distances, facing discrimination, or simply being turned away. Against this backdrop of unequal healthcare access, diseases like syphilis thrived within these marginalized communities. Syphilis, a bacterial infection that can cause devastating long-term health issues if left untreated, disproportionately affected Black Americans during this era. Poverty, lack of education about disease prevention, and insufficient public health infrastructure combined to create a perfect storm where syphilis spread unchecked. Unlike wealthier or white communities who might access emerging medical treatments, many Black individuals were left vulnerable, their suffering largely invisible to mainstream society. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment exploited this dire situation in the worst possible way. The men recruited for the study were primarily poor sharecroppers, laboring under difficult conditions and with little formal education. Their limited understanding of medical science and the trusts they placed in government health officials made them easy targets for manipulation. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a vague term that masked the severity of syphilis and other illnesses, and they believed they were receiving legitimate care. However, behind this facade, they were subjects in a study designed not to heal but to observe the progression of an untreated disease. This stark disparity in healthcare was both a cause and effect of the broader racial inequalities of the time. Segregation in medicine was a reflection of the social order, one that systematically disadvantaged Black Americans and kept them at the margins of society. The Tuskegee study did not just take place in a vacuum. It was embedded in a context where Black lives were routinely undervalued and overlooked, while the rest of the country gradually benefited from medical advancements, including the widespread use of penicillin in the 1940s. Black communities were often excluded from these breakthroughs. The lack of adequate healthcare infrastructure in Black neighborhoods meant that diseases like syphilis not only went untreated but also went undiagnosed for long periods. The combination of poverty, social isolation, and racial discrimination created barriers to preventive education, testing, and treatment. This neglect contributed to higher rates of infection and more severe health consequences within these communities. The Tuskegee experiment took this already tragic reality and turned it into a cruel and calculated abuse. Instead of intervening to provide treatment as soon as effective cures were available, the Public Health Service chose to withhold care from these men, allowing the disease to progress unchecked so they could study its natural course. This decision was possible only because of the systemic racism that devalued Black lives and the social structures that made their suffering invisible to those in power. This historic injustice has had lasting effects. The mistrust in medical institutions that grew from the betrayal of the Tuskegee study is not just a relic of the past, but a living legacy. It has influenced health behaviors, medical research participation, and the relationship between Black communities and healthcare providers even today. Understanding the deeply rooted inequities in access to healthcare during the segregated South helps explain why these wounds persist and highlights the ongoing need for equity and justice in medicine. The story of healthcare inequality during this period is essential to grasp the full scope of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment's cruelty. It was a symptom of a society that permitted and perpetuated racial discrimination at every level, including the most fundamental right to health. By acknowledging this context, we gain a clearer understanding of why such a study could happen and the profound consequences it had not just for the men involved but for generations that followed. In reflecting on this history, it becomes evident how critical it is to dismantle the barriers that prevent equitable healthcare access. The legacy of segregation and discrimination continues to impact health outcomes and trust in medical institutions. The Tuskegee tragedy teaches us that true progress in healthcare must be rooted in justice, respect, and a commitment to serving all communities fairly and compassionately. In the heart of rural Alabama, where tight-knit Black communities leaned on one another for support amid widespread discrimination, the U.S. Public Health Service found a way to infiltrate and exploit that trust. To recruit men for the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, the agency did not act alone. It partnered with respected local Black institutions, including the Tuskegee Institute, a well-known center for African American education and culture. This collaboration lent a veneer of legitimacy and reassurance to the study, convincing men and their families that they were stepping into a program designed to help them, not harm them. The men, many of whom were sharecroppers with little formal education and limited medical knowledge, placed their faith in these institutions and the health officials who approached them. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a term that, while vague, was familiar in the community and suggested care for various ailments without invoking fear or stigma. This carefully crafted message masked the true purpose of the study: to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men, even as cures existed and were withheld behind doors. However, the reality was far darker. The Public Health Service deliberately kept the men in the dark about their actual diagnosis, choosing not to inform them that they were infected with syphilis. The choice to withhold this critical information was not a mistake or oversight. It was a calculated decision to preserve the study's integrity at the expense of human lives. The men were never given the option to consent fully, deprived of the truth that would have empowered them to make informed decisions about their health and treatment. This deception extended beyond diagnosis. When penicillin emerged as an effective and widely available treatment in the 1940s, the researchers continued to withhold it from the participants. Local doctors, many of whom were part of or influenced by the same health system, were discouraged or even pressured not to provide penicillin to the men in the study. The healthcare providers who should have been advocates for these men instead became enablers of this prolonged suffering. The collaboration with local black institutions played a crucial role in this elaborate ruse. It not only eased recruitment, but also helped suppress suspicion or resistance within the community. These institutions, trusted and respected, lent credibility to the study's promises, making it easier for the Public Health Service to maintain control over the men and the narrative surrounding the experiment. The men's trust was manipulated, their hope for care exploited to keep them enrolled and compliant. The ethical violations here are staggering. Medical research demands honesty, transparency, and respect for participants' autonomy. Yet, in Tuskegee, these principles were abandoned. The men were denied the right to know their health status, to receive treatment, and to make choices about their own bodies. The study turned their lives into an experiment without their genuine understanding or approval. A profound breach of trust and humanity. This betrayal echoes loudly when considering the social and historical context. These men and their communities already faced systemic racism and neglect in healthcare. The Tuskegee study compounded that injustice by transforming a place of potential healing into one of exploitation. The collaboration between the US Public Health Service and black institutions was a double-edged sword. While it facilitated recruitment and community engagement, it also became a tool for deception and control, deepening the wounds of mistrust that still linger. As the decades passed, the men's health declined, and the truth remained hidden until courageous whistleblowers and investigative journalists uncovered the reality in 1972. The public revelation exposed not just the study's scientific flaws, but its profound moral failures. It showed how institutions meant to protect public health could instead perpetuate harm through racial prejudice and unethical practices. Reflecting on this chapter in history, it is clear that the collaboration with local black institutions, while seemingly positive on the surface, was a critical part of the system that allowed this injustice to persist. It reminds us that trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild, especially when it is used as a tool for exploitation. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment serves as a solemn lesson on the importance of transparency, respect, and ethics in all medical research, especially when working with vulnerable communities. The men who were recruited through this collaboration paid an unimaginable price for a study conducted in secrecy and deception. Their story calls on us to ensure that medical research honors the dignity and rights of every individual, to learn from the past, and to build a future where trust between communities and healthcare providers is restored and preserved. Throughout the course of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, the men who believed they were receiving medical care were in fact subjected to a cruel and deceptive practice that extended far beyond simple neglect. Instead of the life-saving treatments they desperately needed, these men were given placebos, aspirin, mineral supplements, and other ineffective substances disguised as medicines. This deliberate substitution was not an oversight or a misguided attempt at care. It was a calculated part of the experiment designed to maintain the illusion of treatment, while allowing syphilis to silently and steadily ravage their bodies over many years. Imagine placing your trust in doctors and health officials, showing up for regular checkups and treatments, only to be handed pills that offer no real relief or cure. These men, many with little education and limited understanding of medical science, were told that these substances would help manage their bad blood. The false reassurance provided by these harmless pills deepened their belief in the care they were supposedly receiving, binding them tighter to the study while their health deteriorated unchecked. As the years passed, the consequences of this deception became tragically clear. Syphilis, left untreated, is a progressive disease that attacks vital organs, including the heart and brain, without proper antibiotics like penicillin, which became widely available in the 1940s. The infection advanced from early, more manageable stages into severe, debilitating conditions. Many men in the study developed neurosyphilis, which can lead to paralysis, mental illness, and blindness. Others suffered from heart disease, strokes, or died prematurely. All the while, the study's researchers observed and recorded these outcomes with clinical detachment, treating human suffering as data points rather than lives lost or ruined. This systematic denial of effective treatment, replaced by placebo pills, was one of the most heinous aspects of the experiment. It violated the most basic principles of medical ethics, including beneficence, the duty to help patients, and non-maleficence, the obligation to do no harm. Instead of protecting these men, the experimenters allowed them to endure pain and irreversible damage for the sake of a scientific question that could have been answered without sacrificing human lives. The psychological impact on the participants was also profound. Though often less visible, many of these men lived in constant pain and confusion, not understanding why their condition worsened despite their apparent adherence to medical advice. Their families watched helplessly as their loved ones declined, unsure why treatment seemed ineffective. The men's trust in the healthcare system was exploited, leaving them isolated in their suffering. Even more heartbreaking is that during the entire period when these men were given placebos, the rest of the country was making tremendous strides in treating syphilis. Penicillin, heralded as a miracle drug, had transformed the prognosis of this once feared disease. Yet, these men were deliberately excluded from receiving this breakthrough treatment. Local doctors were discouraged from intervening, and government officials maintained the charade to preserve the study's continuity. The use of placebos in this context was not a benign scientific tool but a weapon of betrayal. It symbolized the profound disregard for Black lives and health that permeated the study and reflected broader societal inequalities. The men's bodies became battlegrounds where prejudice, power, and pseudoscience played out with devastating consequences. When the truth about this deception finally came to light in 1972, it sparked outrage not only because of the medical malpractice, but because of the fundamental violation of trust. The fact that these men had been lied to and denied effective care for decades revealed a system deeply broken by racism and unethical practices. The placebo pills were not just ineffective treatments, they were a symbol of the betrayal of an entire community. Today, reflecting on the use of placebos in the Tuskegee study forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about medical ethics, racial injustice, and the importance of informed consent. It underscores why transparency, respect, and accountability must be central to all healthcare and research practices. The men who endured this cruelty deserve not only to be remembered but to inspire ongoing vigilance to ensure such exploitation never happens again. The story of these placebo pills is a testament to the resilience of those who suffered silently, and a call to action for all who value human dignity and justice in medicine. It reminds us that real healing begins with truth and respect, and that any medical intervention without these is not care but cruelty. One of the most devastating and unforgivable aspects of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment was the complete absence of informed consent. In the realm of medical ethics, informed consent is a cornerstone principle. It requires that participants fully understand the nature of the study they are involved in, including the potential risks, benefits, and alternatives. Yet, in this dark chapter of history, the men at the center of the experiment were kept in the dark about the true purpose of the study and the serious risks it entailed. They were misled, manipulated, and denied the basic right to make informed decisions about their own bodies and health. These men, many of whom were poor sharecroppers with limited education, trusted the doctors and officials who assured them they would receive treatment for their ailments. They were told they had bad blood, a term that masked the true diagnosis of syphilis and obscured the gravity of the disease. With no clear explanation of what syphilis was or the potential consequences of leaving it untreated, the participants had no way to understand the severity of their condition or the implications of participating in the study. They consented under false pretenses, believing they were receiving legitimate medical care rather than being subjects in a long-term experiment. The concept of informed consent was virtually non-existent in this study's design. Researchers did not provide detailed information about the study's goals or the fact that an effective cure penicillin was available, but would be deliberately withheld. This omission was not merely a lapse in communication. It was a deliberate strategy to ensure the men remained enrolled and unaware of the true nature of their participation. The men were denied the agency to decide whether they wanted to accept the risks involved or seek treatment elsewhere. This breach of trust was profound. In medical research today, informed consent is more than a formality. It is a vital ethical safeguard that respects the autonomy and dignity of participants. It empowers individuals to make choices aligned with their values and best interests. The Tuskegee study, by contrast, stripped these men of their autonomy, treating them as mere objects for observation rather than as human beings with rights and feelings. Without informed consent, the participants were subjected to procedures and examinations that they might never have agreed to if fully informed. These included painful spinal which were justified by researchers as necessary for gathering data, but were deeply invasive and frightening for the men. The study turned into a trap, where men, unaware of the risks or the fact that they were part of a study, continued to return for appointments under false pretenses. This lack of transparency extended beyond the individual participants to the broader community. Families were kept in the dark about the true health status of their loved ones, unable to advocate for their care or protect them from harm. The community's trust was exploited by an institution that promised help but delivered betrayal. The failure to obtain informed consent in the Tuskegee experiment stands as a stark warning of what can happen when power imbalances, prejudice, and unethical priorities override respect for human rights. It exposes how vulnerable populations can be exploited when safeguards are ignored and underscores why modern research ethics emphasize informed consent so heavily. This ethical violation also helps explain the long-lasting impact of the study on the African American community's trust in the healthcare system. The knowledge that a government agency conducted such a study without transparency or respect has made many hesitant to seek medical care or participate in research. Even decades later, the psychological scars run deep, fueled by the memory of this profound betrayal. Looking back, it is clear that informed consent is not just a procedural step but a fundamental expression of respect for the individual. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment shattered that respect in the most tragic way, turning men who deserved care into unwitting victims of an experiment that prioritized data over dignity. Their story reminds us that medical research must never compromise ethics and that protecting human rights is inseparable from the pursuit of scientific knowledge. By understanding the gravity of this breach, We honor the victims and reinforce the commitment to ethical standards that safeguard participants today. It is a lesson in humility and responsibility, a reminder that behind every data point is a human life deserving of honesty, care, and respect. In 1972, after decades of silence and suffering, the dark truth of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment was finally brought to light, thanks to the relentless work of investigative journalist Jean Heller. Her groundbreaking reporting did more than just expose a secret medical study. It ignited a firestorm of public outrage that would reverberate across the United States, shaking the very foundations of trust between the government, medical institutions, and the African American community. For years, the Tuskegee study had remained hidden in the shadows, shielded by government officials and health agencies reluctant to acknowledge the ethical horror they had allowed to unfold. The men involved, many now elderly and gravely ill, had endured unimaginable suffering, their lives stolen by a callous experiment that prioritized data over human dignity. Yet, despite whispers of wrongdoing within medical circles, the full story remained buried until Jean Heller's investigation pierced the veil of secrecy. Her report, published by the Associated Press, detailed how hundreds of black men in Alabama had been denied effective treatment for syphilis, even after penicillin became widely accepted as a cure in the 1940s. It revealed how these men had been misled into believing they were receiving free medical care, when in truth they were part of a decades-long study to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis. The report was shocking, not just for its content, but for the systemic racism and betrayal it exposed within a government agency entrusted with protecting public health. The reaction to Heller's expose was swift and intense. Civil rights organizations immediately condemned the study as a blatant violation of human rights and a horrifying example of racial injustice. Religious leaders, medical professionals, and politicians joined the chorus, calling for accountability and justice for the victims. The revelation deepened the already strained relationship between the African American community and the healthcare system, where mistrust had long simmered due to historical abuses and discrimination. This public outcry forced the government to act. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment was abruptly halted, ending a study that had caused untold suffering over 4 decades. Congressional hearings were convened to investigate how such a gross ethical violation could have persisted for so long without intervention. These hearings uncovered the complicity of various officials who either ignored warnings or actively covered up the truth to protect the study's continuation. Jean Heller's courageous journalism did more than expose a scandal. It gave a voice to the victims whose stories had been silenced for years. Her work underscored the vital role of a free press in holding powerful institutions accountable and protecting the rights of vulnerable populations. It reminded the nation that transparency and truth are essential pillars of justice and democracy. The fallout from the exposure also led to meaningful changes in medical ethics and research practices. The Tuskegee study became a cautionary tale, prompting reforms such as the requirement for informed consent, the establishment of institutional review boards, and increased scrutiny of studies involving human subjects. These changes aim to prevent a repetition of such an atrocity and restore faith in medical research. Despite these reforms, the legacy of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment continues to influence perceptions of medical research within the African American community. The scars left by decades of deception and exploitation have created a lasting wariness that researchers and healthcare providers must work diligently to overcome through transparency, respect, and equitable treatment. Jean Heller's expose remains a powerful testament to the impact of truth-telling and investigative courage. It brought a hidden atrocity into the light, sparked necessary public discourse, and paved the way for justice and reform. Her work not only changed the course of medical ethics, but also challenged a nation to confront its failures and commit to a more just and humane future. The story of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, illuminated by Heller's reporting, serves as a solemn reminder of the consequences of unchecked power and prejudice. It calls on us all to remain vigilant, to demand accountability, and to ensure that the dignity and rights of every individual are upheld in medicine and beyond. The exposure of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment in 1972 marked a turning point, bringing an end to one of the most egregious violations of medical ethics in American history. Once the truth was revealed, public pressure and outrage forced the government to immediately terminate the study. But ending the experiment was only the beginning of addressing the damage that had been done over 4 long decades. For the men who had suffered, many of whom were elderly, physically debilitated, and mentally scarred, and for their families, the aftermath was a mixture of relief, anger, and deep sorrow. Following the study's abrupt end, efforts were made to provide restitution and care to the survivors and those affected by the experiment. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the men involved, representing not only the participants themselves but also their wives, widows, and children who had been exposed to syphilis unknowingly. This lawsuit acknowledged the far-reaching consequences of the study, which had not only impacted the men's health, but had also caused emotional trauma and health risks within their families and communities. The legal battle culminated in a $10 million settlement, a substantial sum at the time, intended to compensate the survivors and their families for the immense suffering and betrayal they endured. Alongside this financial compensation, the government committed to providing free medical care to the survivors, offering treatments and health services to mitigate the ongoing effects of syphilis and related complications. This care extended to the families, recognizing the intergenerational impact of the disease and the study's deception. While the settlement and medical care provided some measure of justice, they could never fully repair the damage done. The men lost decades of their lives to untreated illness. Many died prematurely, and those who survived carried lifelong health burdens and the heavy weight of betrayal. The compensation could not replace the years of pain, lost opportunities, and fractured families that resulted from a study that sacrificed human lives for data. The legacy of the Tuskegee study also left deep psychological scars. Survivors grappled with feelings of anger, mistrust, and disillusionment, not only with the medical establishment, but with a government that had turned against its own citizens. Families struggled with the knowledge that their loved ones had been deliberately denied treatment, and communities wrestled with the broader implications of systemic racism that allowed such an atrocity to unfold. This moment in history sparked broader conversations about medical ethics, racial injustice, and the responsibilities of governments and health institutions to protect vulnerable populations. The settlement, while a step forward, also highlighted the importance of accountability and transparency to prevent similar abuses in the future. The government's eventual apology in 1997, delivered by President Bill Clinton, echoed the sentiments of regret and recognition of the profound wrongs committed. The apology acknowledged the deeply, profoundly, morally wrong nature of the study and reaffirmed a commitment to equality, dignity, and integrity in healthcare. It was a formal recognition that the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment was not just a medical failure, but a moral and social crisis. As history reflects on this chapter, the settlement and medical care stand as both restitution and reminders that justice can be sought, but that trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. The story of the Tuskegee survivors urges ongoing vigilance and action to ensure that medicine serves all people fairly, that ethical boundaries are never crossed, and that the lessons of the past guide the future. The settlement was more than a financial transaction. It was a symbol of recognition for the suffering endured and a call to honor the dignity of those who were wronged. It represents a commitment that the voices of the victims will not be forgotten, and that their experience will continue to inform the pursuit of justice and equity in healthcare for generations to come. In 1997, a pivotal moment in the history of the United States, reckoning with its past injustices, unfolded when President Bill Clinton stood before the nation and delivered a formal apology on behalf of the U.S. government for the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. This apology was not just a political gesture, but a profound acknowledgement of a deep moral failing that had cast a long shadow over the country's commitment to justice, equality, and human dignity. For decades, the victims of the Tuskegee study black men who had been deceived, denied treatment, and subjected to unimaginable suffering had carried the weight of betrayal in silence or quiet anguish. Their pain extended beyond their own bodies to their families and communities, fostering mistrust in medical institutions and government agencies that still lingers in many hearts today. The study's exposure in the early 1970s had brought some measure of justice, but it was this public apology, delivered more than 2 decades later, that finally brought a voice of official remorse and recognition. President Clinton's words were solemn and heartfelt, reflecting the gravity of the injustice inflicted. He described the Tuskegee experiment as deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. A phrase that conveyed not only the breach of medical ethics, but the failure of the nation to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The apology underscored how the government's actions had violated trust and dignity, betraying the very principles upon which the country was founded. In that moment, the apology served as a symbolic act of healing, a step toward reconciliation that acknowledged the past without attempting to erase it. Clinton emphasized the importance of remembering this chapter in American history, not to dwell on shame, but to learn from it and ensure such a violation could never happen again. He honored the men who had suffered, recognizing their strength and resilience despite the cruelty they endured. The apology also addressed the broader implications of the Tuskegee experiment for the African American community and the nation's healthcare system. It recognized the lasting impact of systemic racism, the fear and skepticism that arose from such egregious betrayal, and the urgent need to rebuild trust between minority communities and medical institutions. This recognition was crucial, as the study had become emblematic of a history of medical exploitation and racial discrimination that extended beyond Tuskegee itself. Clinton's speech underscored that true progress required confronting uncomfortable truths and committing to transparency, accountability, and ethical standards. It was a call to action for the medical community, policymakers, and society at large to uphold the highest principles of respect, fairness, and care for all individuals, regardless of race or background. The apology was also a reminder that justice is not solely measured by legal settlements or policy changes, but by the recognition of harm and the willingness to make amends. It gave voice to those who had been silenced and sent a message that their suffering mattered, that history would not forget their story. In the years following the apology, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment has continued to serve as a powerful lesson in medical ethics and social justice education. It remains a cautionary tale taught in universities, a reference point in discussions about informed consent, racial bias, and the responsibilities of researchers and institutions to protect human rights. The legacy of President Clinton's apology resonates far beyond the walls of the White House. It symbolizes a commitment to confronting the painful parts of history with honesty and compassion, ensuring that the dignity of every person is respected. It challenges us all to learn from the past and to foster a future where healthcare is equitable and trust is restored. This moment of apology closes a painful chapter but also opens the door to ongoing dialogue and healing. It reminds us that acknowledging wrongdoing is essential but must be accompanied by meaningful action to address systemic inequalities and protect the vulnerable. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment stands as a stark reminder of the consequences when power is abused and ethics are ignored. President Clinton's apology, with its candid recognition of moral failure, offers a pathway toward redemption and reconciliation, a commitment that the mistakes of the past will guide the pursuit of a more just and humane future. The legacy of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment is not confined to history books or isolated incidents of the past. It lives on today in the form of a deep and lasting mistrust of the medical system within many African American communities. This mistrust is understandable, born from decades of betrayal, suffering, and unethical treatment. The study's horrific legacy continues to cast a long shadow over the relationship between healthcare providers and African Americans, influencing attitudes toward medical care, research, and especially preventive measures like vaccines. For many African Americans, the memory of Tuskegee represents more than just a single experiment. It symbolizes a broader history of medical exploitation and racial injustice. This history has understandably led to skepticism about the motives of medical institutions and government health agencies. The fear that individuals might once again be subjected to unethical experimentation or denied proper care has contributed to hesitancy in seeking medical treatment, participating in clinical trials, or accepting vaccinations, including during public health crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. This skepticism, while rooted in painful truth, also highlights the urgent need for the medical community to rebuild trust through transparency, respect, and cultural understanding. It is not enough to rely solely on scientific facts or public health messaging. Meaningful engagement with communities, acknowledgement of past wrongs, and a commitment to equitable care are essential to healing these historic wounds. Moreover, the Tuskegee legacy has contributed to ongoing health disparities, disproportionate rates of illness, lower access to quality care, and worse health outcomes among African Americans. Addressing these disparities requires not only medical innovation but also social justice, policy changes, and community empowerment. The lessons of Tuskegee remind us that ethical care is inseparable from equity and respect for human dignity. As we reflect on this painful history, it is vital to honor the memory of those who suffered and to commit ourselves to a future where such injustices can never happen again. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment must serve as a powerful reminder of why ethical standards, informed consent, and the protection of vulnerable populations are non-negotiable pillars of medical research and practice. Thank you for taking the time to learn about this important chapter in history. Understanding the past helps us build a better future, one where trust is restored, dignity is upheld, and healthcare truly serves everyone equally. If you found this story meaningful, please like this video, subscribe to the channel for more insightful content, and share it with others to spread awareness. Wishing you all a peaceful night and sweet dreams. Sleep well, and take care.